Hey everyone, my name is Kunal Man, and today we'll be looking into serverless microservices. So, uh, before we go ahead into our uh, demo and all the fancy stuff, I wanted to go over a quick overview. So, I want to first talk to you about the definition of serverless and microservices. Then I want to talk about all the technologies and tools we're going to use to get a serverless microservice deployed on the cloud. Then we're going to have a demo. So a serverless architecture is a way to build and run applications without having to manage infrastructure. And microservice is a type of architecture that goes on top of serverless, if you want to think it of that way. And it's to say that serverless architecture can be applied to many different type of application. It just doesn't have to just be microservices. It can be web application or an API. It can all be serverless. And actually, serverless API is what we're going to try to do today using microservices. And microservice architecture, or simply microservices, is a distinctive method of developing software systems that try to focus on building single function modules with well-defined interfaces and operations. So in a more general sense, we try to deploy our whole application, develop our application in terms of functions. Maybe you have something like a hello function, and then you have send a friend request function, and you go on and on until you have your whole application developed. So the tools and technologies we're going to use, we're going to try to deploy an API. We're going to use Postman. I just wanted to throw that in there because it's an awesome tool and comes in really handy. We're going to do Azure Functions and AWS Lambda. We might not get to deploy AWS Lambda, but I'm going to try my best to get to that. The reason why we are doing Azure Functions is it's a bit easier to deploy. So let me just kind of like show you a couple of things real quick here. So an API is the full form is an application programming interface, and it is a software intermediary. So like you want to think of it as this, like you have a web app, and via internet you send requests. You can have this abstraction layer from your servers and your database, and that's how you will access your backend application logic. So I'd highly recommend you read this. I find it to be very interesting here. And a little something about this is one of the bigger vendors for API development. So if we try to talk about this intermediary, we have this abstraction layer, and one thing that we want to do is actually test whether our API is going to work that way we want it to work. And one of the ways you do that is send a request and look out for response. So maybe you say something like have Google Chrome send request, but Google Chrome is, you can do it, but it's not the most used tool out there. Usually what people would use is something like a Postman. Just kind of a history story here. Postman was actually a tool. It was a Google Chrome extension, which got such a huge support from the community that it actually developed into its own application, and it's actually available for download. I have it down here, and we're gonna play around with it in the demo. And you can do a lot of fancy stuff, but at the very basic, what you do is you so example, this is your Postman here, and you say Postman send a request to this server, and it sends that request and looks out for a response, and like prettifying JSON and all that stuff is far easier in Postman. Azure Functions is what we're going to use for the Azure cloud. It's just it's an event-driven serverless computer, but it's more than that, and they're true about that. And you can see there are some pretty big companies that use these, and like some really big companies use functions, and you can really make your application scalable by having various smaller stacks, and a lot of programming languages can be used to develop these. So for the Azure side, from the Microsoft offering, which is at the second biggest cloud provider, we have Azure Functions. On AWS side, we have AWS Lambda. And you'll hear people say, oh, Lambda functions, and that's kind of very true, because on Lambda is just a way of deploying your functions onto the cloud. So people usually say Lambda functions. That would mean one function in your application. Yeah, and like the same way we talked about our definition of serverless is that you don't have to manage your infrastructure, which is kind of like talked about by Lambda, is that without thinking about servers, because sometimes when you're trying to do a prototype or build an application, it can really be a uh, hassle to work around with so many things and manage a server, which might not be your expertise. So Lambda will integrate with other applications, but for our use, we're gonna try to just deploy an API in that given time frame. So one thing that we have to be aware, and why I say it's a bit more complex and requires a bit more of technical expertise in the API development landscape for AWS Lambda, is because you have to actually use Amazon API Gateway. And as you can see, this is you on this side of the spectrum. And the way you will access any service like AWS Lambda here, and you can access all of these services as well, you will do it using the API gateway. So when it comes to deploying APIs on Lambda, you have to actually deploy two services and integrate them together. Also, there's a very big emphasis on security roles and how different applications talk, and what kind of permissions do they have on each other, and that can really be complex over time. So that's why if we don't get to this AWS Lambda deployment in our given video, I might make a follow-up video if you want to check that out. Other than that, we for sure gonna go through our Azure functions and do a very simple application development. Thank you. Well, on our agenda, the next thing we have is our demos. Here we are in our Azure dashboard. And to deploy an Azure function, you can either deploy them from app services here. That's kind of like a shortcut they have, and all the favorites. We're gonna go up here in functions, search for function app, and we say create. So we're gonna give it a name. We're gonna give it just test for now. Test is taken, so test canal. And so that can be anything. Maybe give it a more indicative name, maybe like test API, but that is taken because it's a global namespace. So adding my name usually helps us out in taking care of the naming issues. You can have multiple subscription. We have pay as you go. I don't have any resource group right now, so we're gonna create a new resource group and we're gonna call it backend. So just a little something about resource group is that you want to think of them as different sections of your cloud infrastructure, different parts of your cloud and your server that causes you money. So maybe like backend, front end, database. Database can be part of backend, can be split from backend. So you kind of have a lot of options of setting up your resource group, and it's totally up to the person. You can consumption plan is the one we're gonna stick with. If you want, you can read up on that in Azure documentation. Location, better deployed closer to your location. Runtime stack, we're gonna say Node.js, and under storage. So every function is, you have to deploy a function, so you have to deploy actual code on the function app. So you usually have some kind of storage account associated with it, and because I don't have any storage account right now, I have to create one. So I can probably say test API canal storage, and little something about application insight is more of an advanced feature. It's a monitoring solution that lets you monitor your application, the compute usage and all the IO. So we're gonna disable that for now and just create it. So it's gonna take a couple of moments to deploy, and we'll be back. Meanwhile, I want to show you Postman. So this is your Postman workspace, and you click the plus button right here, and then you can have a request. So for example, we have get. So these are all the HTTP requests you can make. and we'll put our Azure function request URL here. There are a couple other things you can do. Sometimes you have to send parameters, so maybe something like https demo.com/demo.com, and then you might have something like you telling them what's your name, so you say name here, in the value you say Kunal Man. So as you can see up there, when I changed it, it dynamically was going up there and editing the URL for me. So it's kind of handy if you don't know how to edit those URLs. It's not the most convenient solution to edit those URLs yourself. Authorization, just want to talk about that. A lot of APIs out there, like Google APIs, Facebook APIs, they actually require you to authenticate to use the API, and that can include an API key. That can be OAuth, so that's something like your username and a password, and then a cookie you download. And you can see all of these methods are here. This makes it really easy to authenticate. And headers is the request you send. You can allow and add on some specific attributes on that. Body is how you will send your data. So there are actually two ways, and this took me a lot of time to initially figure it out. I read a couple of articles and then started to kind of make sense. So there are two things you can do actually. So you actually can send your data via a HTTP request using the query parameters right here. And what query parameters will do is they will add your information in the URL. But sometimes you might say, oh, I just want to I have a lot of information, and if I have a long URL, that might not be the most pretty thing. So you can actually come here and say, oh, I have form data. So this will be something like HTTP, HTML form, the data that you send over HTTP. So we say row. I just want to add row data, and I want to add a JSON. So we can create a JSON file here and say name attribute gets my name. So I think we have to add this. So you kind of have a key value pair, and then as you can see, you still are sending your name to the API, but you're not sending it to the URL. So your URL is still good looking. For the demo purposes, we're going to stick with parameters. They're just very easy to work with. One thing I would like to say is that when you make the decision of switching between parameters and body, on the API side, your code will change, and you would actually have to make changes there, saying something from like request.query.parameters to request.body.parameter. All right, so it seems like our deployment was successful. So we can see in our all resources here, we have a API app service functions app deployed here with a associated storage account. So we go here, select the function, so you create a function inside of it, and now we say what kind of trigger we want to execute this function. And as we kind of talked about before, this is an event driven system, so we have events that would trigger your function to run. So we're going to use HTTP trigger, which will be our API, which would basically give us the API endpoint. So what it does is that when you deploy a HTTP trigger function, it gives you a sample code initially, and let's see, kind of like analyze this code here. And what it's saying is that this is more for exporting and exposing the function. So you have an asynchronous function, and you are logging these logs here, and the logs we can monitor them in the console down there. We're going to do that in a bit here. And one of the things this code is doing is that it goes to the request in the query of the request and look out for the name. So when you have a URL, you have a name as a parameter. If you look out for the name, and what it will do, it will actually send out it responds back to the user and say hello and the name of the person, so the person who sent that request. So one thing we can do here is get function URL. So you get this big URL here, and we can just copy that in our URL here. So we, as you can see, we got this code which is identifier for the function. It's something that Azure does for the backend, I think, to identify which function to target. What we're going to do is append our thing, which is name, and append our name here. And what that will do is come here, it should log this and then send out a response back. So let's open the console here. No new trace. Let's make sure we are connected. So hopefully, fingers crossed, if we send this request, we get our name back. Hello Kunal Man. The name that we gave to the request comes back. And in the information trace here, you can see this function was programmatically called via the host API. And this is a trigger thing which was telling it what caused this function to run at the first place. More importantly, JavaScript HTTP trigger function processed a request, which was a log here. So it first came in, logged this thing right here, then executed function.http trigger 1 and gave a success code. The success code came in because it had a context in the it found a name inside the query. If we don't send a name, what it should do, it should, rather than going inside the if loop, it should actually go inside the else loop. And let's give that a try. So I'm going to just take my name out of there, and we should say, okay, please pass a name on the query string or in the request body. So yeah, here we have our function, and it still succeeded. One thing to notice is that it still succeeded, and that means that the function ran successfully. That doesn't mean that you're going to get the right response that you wanted. So the next thing I want to try is something like, if the name is equal to something, we want to print out something different. So let's see if we can make some changes in the code here, and let's say hello request.query.name plus edited in the demo. So, and one thing we're going to remember is to save it, otherwise it's not going to save in the storage we just attached it to. And let's try to send the same request with the name and hello. And yeah, we got the formatting is a bit off because we're supposed to add a full stop and a space, and that should actually do the formatting right. Today we looked into serverless microservices. We looked into what is an API. We looked into Postman, one of the famous tools that we use to deploy and test web APIs. We also deployed a web API on Azure Function. So one thing I really want to talk about is the pricing information. As you guys saw today, when we were deploying the function, it was very easy. It was just a couple of clicks. You have to be aware of a bunch of terms and you'll be good to go. But I want you to pay very close attention to, we never really looked into pricing. There wasn't any alert by console saying that if you deploy this function, this is how much it's going to cost you. And it is your responsibility to go in and read the pricing information, and I really encourage you to do so. One of the social issues with deploying some of the cloud services is when you are unaware of the pricing and you get an unexpected bill at the end of the month, that discourages a lot of people from taking the full advantage of the cloud. And I don't want that to happen to you. If you want, I can make another video talking about the pricing. It might be a little confusing at first because Azure Function is definitely a more complex pricing structure. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you learned something today, and if you have any comments or if you want me to do something differently, please let me know at this email. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.